All right. Welcome, everybody, to another A4C and Trulieve panel. This one is going to be about cannabis and brain trauma. We have a great panel with us today. As always, we've had several of these, and they just keep getting better. Ali Stoddard, she's been on one before. She's joining us again. Ali Stoddard is an A4C athlete ambassador, owner and founder of Greenally CBD. She has 25 years of experience in orthopedics, pain management, osteoporosis, and wound healing. Ali is an A4C athlete ambassador, like I said, and a former collegiate swimmer. Joining us also, Dr. Joshua Moore. Dr. Moore has joined us in the past as well. He is a licensed physician who practices general surgery and holistic medicine at Dr. Damas Wellness in South Florida. Graduated from FSU with a bachelor's in exercise science, followed by a master's in biological sciences from Barry University, before earning his medical degree from the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And finally, we have Dr. Wayback, president and founder of Dr. Jane, a mobile concierge medical cannabis practice based in South Florida. Dr. Wayback is a U.S. Navy veteran and a neurosurgery trained physician. He's also an A4C athlete ambassador and a former collegiate hockey player. All right. So my name is Nate Jackson. I'm going to start this off and talk a little bit about why this topic is important to me. I started playing football when I was a freshman in high school. That was right around the same time I discovered cannabis socially. And probably a month before I ever strapped on a helmet and started cracking it into other guys running full speed, I consumed cannabis for the first time. I didn't know it at the time, but at least from what I've learned, I may have been, and this is where you guys come in to tell me if I'm right about this, but I may have been protecting my brain in advance of brain injury. That started my relationship with cannabis there when I was 14 years old. Obviously, it was illegal and it was social, so I did it very sparingly and tried not to get caught. But football turned into a passion for me. I played high school football, I played college football, and I played in the NFL for 6 years, during which there was a lot of that brain smacking. And also during which I medicated with cannabis from time to time, more so at the end of my career. But couldn't tell anybody about it. That was how it was. We were getting tested for it pretty regularly, so it was a secret. It was always a secret until I stopped playing football for good. I started writing. I wrote a book about my experience in the NFL, 2 paragraphs about cannabis, 2 paragraphs. That was it, about how I preferred cannabis as a medication, especially at the end of my career, to the pills that I was being given. And it was from those 2 little paragraphs that I met people like you and have been pulled into this conversation about cannabis, and I've learned a lot about it since then. But we are still learning, and there's a lot I don't know about cannabis, especially cannabis and brain trauma. So we're going to start with you, Ali. What do we know about cannabis and brain trauma?
Well, the interesting part, the first thing we know is what the government got their patent on was for ischemic injury, for a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. And they were talking about synthetic, but we do know that, if you can get an anti-inflammatory like CBD into the body within the first 4 to 6 hours after a traumatic brain injury, you can offset some of the secondary problems that we have with inflammation and tissue death of the tissue itself. So we know that. We know the brain is comprised of omega-3 fatty acids. So of course, omega-3s, DHA, EPA are good brain foods, MCT oil, coconut oil, good brain foods. And we were all taught that, hey, as an athlete, and I will say, yes, I swam for Cal, but I also played rugby for 12 years, and I'm currently a soccer player. So I'm very knowledgeable about brain injuries. Luckily, I haven't had one. My son has had 2, and we pulled him out of rugby. But so we know a lot about how to help the brain. We don't know a ton about injuries, but I certainly think that CBD is an excellent route for somebody to take, especially immediately after an injury. I've seen it with my own family.
There's a lot of good stuff there, and I want to come back to some of that, but I also want to introduce the panelists. So Dr. Joshua Moore, anything else that you care to add about that, the correlation between cannabis and brain trauma?
Yeah, I mean, there's like every other condition that cannabis can be used to treat, or you know, most people use have been using for years to treat. There's not enough research that's done, and I think that's you know, that's the first thing I want to lead with, is that we are really far behind on the research that needs to be done just as a whole, you know, because of how beneficial cannabis is, because of how detrimental some of the other treatments are, and because of the safety profile of cannabis compared to some of the other treatments. So, you know, one of the I'm gonna talk about some of this stuff more in detail, but Ali mentioned getting some cannabinoids into your system immediately after an injury. I'm going to talk about a study that looked at the toxicology screens of people who came into trauma bays with traumatic brain injury, and how cannabis helped to increase their rates of survival over those who didn't have cannabis on board. So
can you just get into that right away and just talk about that?
Yeah, study? Sure. All right. So they did this study at a level 1 trauma center. So that's the highest acuity trauma center. And they looked at all of the traumatic brain injuries that came in over the course of, I think, 3 years. They ended up having 446 patients that came in with traumatic brain injuries who they could include in the study. They also tested them for, you know, they did a tox screen, which isn't always common at all trauma centers. But for the purposes of this, they screened all these people, and they found that about 20%, which is pretty consistent with the numbers that we know for use in the United States. 20% of people who were who had a traumatic brain injury tested positive for THC, and the overall mortality rate in the THC positive group was about, well, let me start this. The overall mortality rate for everybody who came in, for those 446 patients, was about 10%. Okay. But for the THC positive group, 2.4%, compared to the mortality for the THC negative group, which was 11.5%. So, you know, almost a five-fold increase there. And, you know, they adjusted for the differences, and they found that a THC positive screen was indeed independently associated with better survival after traumatic brain injury.
So you're saying basically, and the thing I was inkling towards about protecting your brain in advance of a brain injury, if you are consuming cannabis and you know you're going to get hit in the head, it's probably smart, right?
Yeah.
And if you just happen to get hit in the head and you also consume cannabis, you probably have a better odds of survival. Dr. Wayback, talk about yourself a little bit and this connection between cannabis and brain trauma, and what brought you to the party. You're muted right now. Can you unmute yourself? No? Okay, Jeffrey, can you unmute Dr. Wayback?
Yeah, there we go. Hey,
right.
Thanks, Jeff. No, I'm sorry about that. It said that only the host could do it. So I am, first I'm going to approach this as an AA. So my name is Rick, and I've had 13 concussions. Welcome. No, I mean, yeah, it sucked. It just off the bat. No, seriously, thank you to both Ali and Josh for hitting those points. And what I will mention is my very first exposure to cannabis was actually on one of the experiments that provided data to the 2006 patent filing by the Department of Defense. So essentially what we were doing was inducing strokes in rats and then giving them different synthetic compounds to see what would protect the brain. Turns out that two of the compounds we used were synthetic CBD, and holy cow, did they work. So to your questions about, you know, whether taking any cannabinoid pre-trauma actually does anything, the answer is emphatic yes. We don't actually know when would be an optimal time to do it. Obviously, if you knew the time of trauma, the best advice would be to avoid the trauma. So, but what we do know, just on gross examination of the brain after autopsy, is giving the person who is about to undergo brain trauma a cannabinoid, and in this case it was synthetic CBD, as close to the time of trauma yielded the best outcomes. And in our case, what we used as outcome was not clinical, but it was on gross anatomy. So we were actually just looking at raw brain and seeing how much, in this case, CBD protected. So that was, I was not lucky enough to discover cannabis before I started playing. It was much after, but I can tell you it's an incredibly powerful tool, and incredibly powerful therapy that I think we should be able to get into more hands.
So how does cannabis protect the brain in advance of a brain injury? What does it do? Does it go in there and you know, erect some armor? Does it?
No, so it's actually really cool. So in order to understand what CBD in particular is doing in the brain during a traumatic episode, you first have to understand what's happening before you put a drug in there. Long story short, what's happening is your brain is floating in essentially a bowl, which is your skull. And what happens when you get hit, remember that brain shoots forward or backwards. And the actual type of trauma that you sustain in the center of the brain are shear forces. So it's not that anything's breaking off, it's just that the mass of the brain is trying to resist being sloshed against the skull. And so what you see there are breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and that barrier is what's protecting the brain from harmful chemicals. Well, now that there's no barrier, all of the injured cells are now releasing what we commonly refer to as reactive oxygen species. So these are the things that antioxidants attack. So when somebody says, hey, this is a good antioxidant, that's actually what they're talking about. So this is a negatively charged oxygen ion. And what happens when that is exposed to normal cell membranes, it just starts wreaking havoc. It starts rupturing everything. So what ends up happening with severe brain trauma is the person eventually dies from brain swelling. Essentially what CBD and the other cannabinoids can do is to stabilize the cell membrane so it doesn't swell and rupture. And that's really at the center of what's going on.
Well, I want to dig into that a little bit more, but Ali, I wanted to follow up on something you said at the beginning. 2 points that you made. One was about the ischemia that the government patent addressed, and I want you to talk a little bit more in depth about what that means. Also, we were talking about neuroprotectant in advance of brain injury. You said there's research to suggest you get it into your system 4 to 6 hours afterwards, and that can help too. Can you talk a little bit about the level of protection or healing that provides relative to what we were talking about, the advanced having it before versus having it 4 to 6 hours after, and the ischemia?
Yeah, well, actually, Dr. Waybeck should talk about it. He was involved in the study. So he's the #1 guy. I just think that, yeah. So what I had talked about was that you have tissue death. Tissue death comes from inflammation. Sure, it can come from the like he mentioned, the severe shear force, but it's usually all the inflammation that comes from the traumatic injury that's creating a lot of the tissue death and a lot of the problems. So my point was, you know, CBD and THC are anti-inflammatories, but literally the body, this magical system called the endocannabinoid system, is going to put whatever CBD we have in the body at that moment to the task that needs it the most. So we have an amazingly intelligent body. You get a trauma, if you've got CBD on board, you know, your endocannabinoid system is going to be able to react better. And if you have omega-3s on board, it's even going to be able to make its own CBD, its own cannabinoid. So that was part of my point. And then Dr. Waybeck, you should take it from here.
No, you hit everything.
Yeah, go ahead, doctor.
No, go ahead. I was just saying, you did great. You hit everything.
What I was going to say about you just talked about the CBD being introduced to the system and activating the endocannabinoid system. Can the endocannabinoid system be activated or optimized without cannabis?
That's, I don't know the answer to that. I know that omega-3s are the precursor to the cannabinoids, and I don't think we know that yet. Does anybody know that answer?
There have been studies, and again, these are all preclinical, which I guess is a nice way of saying animal testing.
It's as good as we can do.
Yeah, right. But it's not. They've looked at all the different ways that you can kind of regulate or modulate the endocannabinoid system. So obviously, one of them is introducing the exogenous cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids, or synthetic cannabinoids into the body. Also kind of like modulating the degradative hormones that break down, or degradative enzymes, that break down the cannabinoids. So kind of just allowing them to stay in the mix a little bit longer. I mean, and you mentioned the precursors to actually forming the cannabinoids. So I think there's a lot of different targets that we can go after, but there hasn't really been any real clinical study, or as far as I know, a lot of clinical studies on this yet.
Can we talk a little bit about these studies and how and why it's so difficult to get really concrete data that would change people's minds when it comes to this? You, Dr. Wayback, you just kind of said it's as good as we can get, right?
Yeah. Correct.
Talk about some of the barriers to getting accurate testing when it comes to this stuff, because cannabis is, well, not every plant is the same, right? They're all different, and we're all different, and the way we all respond to cannabis is different. Like, this is a very elementary way of putting it, but I can sit in a circle with 4 of my friends. We all smoke the same joint, and we all have a different reaction to it, right? Or you can consume the same kind of cannabis one day and feel completely great with it. The next day, you consume the same amount of the same kind of cannabis, and all of a sudden you feel off. So does that at all present a barrier to creating concrete clinical data?
So A, you're entirely correct. And B, that phenomenon, the heterogeneity of clinical effect, is a little bit of a barrier, but frankly, it's one of the big things that we really want and need to study. Is why, if I'm taking the exact same compound the exact same way, am I having a different clinical effect? So really, I think Josh is probably going to be in agreement with me here, but the one of, if not the biggest barriers, is just simply the scheduling of cannabis. So I'm sure most people are, if not familiar with, and have heard of this schedule, or the Controlled Substances Act. It's what the U.S. government and the Drug Enforcement Agency decided was going to be the grading system for essentially how illegal something is. The reason, I mean, speaking real nuts, bolts, dollar sense, that we can't conduct the type of studies that we want is because we collectively don't have access to federal funding. And that's a direct result of the Schedule I classification. The vast majority, we actually did this study as a feasibility study for funding for one of our companies. And when you look at NIH funding for really any other discipline, the NIH grants really represent the lion's share of funding that supports research. When you look at cannabis, the biggest federal award, the NIH award that comes to cannabis-related research, caps out at $384,000. And then you're capped at one of those. So really, you're looking at like 96, 97% of all funding that goes into cannabis research is private. Well, tell me how many, it's really hard to find an investor that has that long vision to say, hey, I'm going to plug in this huge amount of money and I know I'm not going to have any sort of return for at least 10 years. It's really hard to find somebody, A, with that big of a checkbook, but B, more importantly, with the stones to stomach, market pressures and everything to hold out for 10 years. So it's a really complex issue.
Yeah. So a quick question about that. Does the medical and scientific community look differently on data that was acquired by private funding? Like, are
Yes,
they worried that it's slanted and they want a certain outcome, they pay for that outcome and they get that outcome?
Definitely. And unfortunately, and Josh, you can definitely comment on this. Unfortunately, that has always been the norm with pharmaceutical companies. You look at anything that was put out for, OxyContin. That's the current hot topic. Well, every positive piece of research was bought and paid for literally by the pharmaceutical companies. And the only pieces of negative research are coming from NIH, with federal funding. So if you look at cannabis, we're missing out on those two things, right? We hardly have any federal funding, and the little bit of private funding that we have realistically is going towards the companies that are making money, or at least have a shot of making money, which really leaves all the research endeavors out in the cold.
Dr. Moore, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree. I think Rick summed it up. There's the first problem is that cannabis is still a Schedule I, which I'm paraphrasing. It means that it has no medical use, and
this has got to be a running joke, right? In the
right,
government,
it's like, where's the camera? It's one thing if we're talking about legalizing it federally and for even, but even, it's got to start with, like, let's have a real conversation about the medical uses of it and reclassify it. It's where it needs to start.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those medical uses. Ali, I was wondering, in your practice, have you encountered people who have used your product for brain trauma, and how has that gone, and how have you prescribed it, and how have you told them, what to look for and how to take it?
I'm going to go back to the last question real quick. The issue, I think a lot, I've worked with many surgeons and many physicians, and they all want double-blinded, randomized, controlled studies. And if you think about it, if you look at all the review of all these studies, they have never been able to replicate these double-blinded, randomized, controlled studies. So they have a double-blinded, randomized, controlled study, but you're also working with a synthetic, usually a synthetic molecule that's very, very homogeneous. And so that's really one really nice control. When you're working with a plant, we're working with plant energy. We're working with the earth's energy, the sun's energy, and the plant, and then how it interacts with this magical endocannabinoid system. We are supposed to ingest this plant. We're not supposed to ingest a synthetic molecule. So, we're going to get a lot better results with a plant. We're going to get a lot different types of studies because we're not looking at a homogeneous synthetic product. So I have to say that. And then going back to, I haven't had, I'm working with one client now who has had, I've worked with a liposomal CBD, and with a brain injury, my first thing is I recommend an osteopath who has craniosacral experience in brain injury, because when there's impact, the brain is shoot like that, and there's what we call a brain strain. There's an area in the brain that the nutrition can't go through, and that if you can heal that part, or if you can somehow an osteopath can actually energetically try to bring that together. So the blood-brain barrier isn't wide open, and also so you can heal that brain strain. it's passive, it's energy, it's, it's woo woo. People go, what the heck is that? But I've seen it work. It worked on my son quite nicely. And then you have to introduce the brain food, you have to introduce the omega-3s as well as the CBD, and you have to reduce dramatically the carbohydrates, the vegetable oils, the dairy, the sugar, all these things that are creating inflammation in our body, create inflammation in the brain, and are fanning the flames of inflammation. If you're trying to heal from a brain injury or literally any disease state, you need to quit introducing inflammation into the brain in the first place. And then we can start to detox. And we have a mineral that we use for a passive detox. And then you have CBD, which by in of itself is, of course, an excellent detoxer, but it's not the only thing. So I always start with if I'm doing a liposome, it's always going to be 1 drop under the tongue. If somebody's really sensitive, they're sensitive to pharmaceuticals, they can't metabolize pharmaceuticals very well, they're sensitive to foods, then I say, put a drop and smell it or taste it, and then no problem, no headache, no hot flash, no tachycardia, then go ahead and put a drop under your tongue, any positive, any negative, then we look for that, and then we just keep upping the dose. Dr. Blair was the chief medical consultant for Elixinol, one of the larger hemp companies, and he and I work quite closely. And he's got a patient, they're up to almost 150 milligrams of CBD a day, which is a lot. So everybody's different. Everybody reacts differently to the plant. And most importantly, everyone's endocannabinoid system is in a different state of repair or disrepair or health. So we got to take all those things into consideration. And
it's not just the CBD or the THC, it's your diet. A lot of people just think that they can take the medicine and then just continue to eat like crap and they're going to heal.
Remember, diet affects the makeup and the function of your endocannabinoid system. So you're both right.
That's right.
And I wanted to touch on this one part that you alluded to, that you've all alluded to, and that's the magic of it, the undefinable effectiveness of cannabis. And that seems to be a roadblock when trying to make headway in the medical scientific community, getting them to accept that there's a magical unknown that just works. How do you go about breaking down that wall to stubborn people who aren't ready to face that?
It's tough. I mean, you got to look at patient outcomes. If we're getting benefit because of X, Y, Z, how we get that benefit, we don't know, right? And so it's tough, but Western medicine wants to quantify, and they'll take, our immune system and chop it up and say this, but the endocannabinoid system, we know we have receptors, we know we produce endocannabinoids. We know that they work opposite of, say, our pain receptors. But there are many things we don't know. And like, for instance, the energy of the earth is in the energy of our body. So when we have the transport of oxygen and nutrients via the capillaries into the cells, that happens under the energy of the earth. And so we got these EMFs, we've got houses, we've got less sun, less connection to the earth. We're getting sicker, but Western medicine doesn't understand that. How do we go there? I don't know. We get to a point where we are at a pandemic and people think that a vaccine is going to save them, when this should have been the biggest learning moment in our history to say, why are Americans so affected by COVID?
Right. And no one's asking that. And when you talk about the treatment, diet is never mentioned. Exercise, never mentioned. Getting in touch with the earth, putting your feet in the dirt, never really mentioned.
Right.
Okay, Rick, I want to talk to you a little bit about your history with concussions. You said you had 13 of them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, you were able to count them, so that's a good sign.
Only after learning how to recount. Let's be completely honest.
Is that good?
Yeah, actually, legit. I had to relearn how to walk, how to eat with utensils. I had to relearn how to talk and write and all that stuff. So,
was this a culmination of multiple concussions that created that, or was it one in particular that was particularly egregious?
Realistically, it was probably a culmination, because if you're doing the math following along at home, there is absolutely no way that a 16-year-old should be on the ice with, you know, even more than 3 concussions at this, you know, in this point in time. But, you know, back in the day,
these all happened. Sorry to interrupt, but these all happened for you as an amateur, as a kid.
Yeah. And realistically, I mean, all, and sorry for cursing, but all bullshit aside, that's actually why I'm legitimately concerned about developing CTE, you know, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That's why I use psychedelics. That's why I use medicinal mushrooms. That's why I use cannabis. But, you know, to
stave off CTE.
Yeah, 100%.
So can you get into that a little bit? Not just the cannabis stuff, but the psychedelics. How does that help prevent or you know, lessen the effects of CTE?
Well, so number one, since we're bringing up psychedelics, I want to go back to your original question about, you know, how do we recruit more patients? How do we get more physician scientists to look at cannabis research more seriously? I see a lot of parallels between psychedelic or entheogenic research, especially with MDMA, psilocybin, and lysergic acid, LSD, and with cannabis. And unfortunately, there is a giant stigma that persists. And frankly, this is something that I still struggle with as a physician doing consultations for neurologists. So because of my background, I get a lot of referrals from neurologists for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS. And even though they refer the patient to me, they have a very hard time with saying, okay, cannabis, you know, is an accepted form. It alongside, or, you know, running parallel to that on the psychedelic side, we have this very big unknown that almost everyone who achieves that level experiences, where you have a true transcendental, you know, spiritual experience. Well, how do you reconcile that with hard, cold science? Well, the reality is we're probably going to have to merge the two. You know, science is going to have a little bit of a softening when it comes to, you know, some things just can't be that rigid in life, like having a double-blinded randomized controlled trial. And then on the other side, we also have to have the, you know, the shamans, I hate saying that, but, you know, the folks that really do see these drugs for what they are, which is not only physical, but spiritual nourishment. We also have to get them to accept the science part. And that's a very big issue. I think from the lay public, we collectively are doing a better job of getting the message out and talking to folks, but there is still absolutely a very hard stigma amongst physicians, MDs and DOs, even take physicians out of it, just do hard academics, PhDs. The stigma is built in, and it's really hard to get around that thing. So I think, I mean, maybe we just start giving these drugs to people and to researchers and say, hey, look, you're not dying. You had a good experience. Let's go. Right.
Or create it as some curriculum that they have to learn along with these other classes about the human body and how to treat it.
Exactly. There's a psychiatrist at my wife's work. She's a hospital COO who I know for a fact has never used cannabis, has never used the psychedelic, and he is now going to give a talk about cannabis and psychedelics. Like, how does that work? Like, no,
what is the angle of his talk going to be?
Just how it can benefit. I mean, truthfully, that's as far as I know.
Okay. Well, at least he's supporting it, right?
He's on the right.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to look at it in the positive light, but at the same time, it's like, there are those of us, in this field who are working our asses off that have so much knowledge to give, and yet the message is being communicated secondhand. It's a really hard pill to swallow, but it's unfortunately one of those realities of life that we just have to work in that framework.
So I want to stay on CTE a little bit because it's a topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. That's my job as the the moderator, to bring it back to home base. But I just wanted to talk about CTE because I may have it as well. My friends may have it.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, it's not detectable in a living body. Is that correct? I know they had developed a technique where, I heard that you were able to see it in a living person, but never heard anything else after that. Talk about diagnosing CTE.
It's a diagnosis of exclusion. Technically, it's the same thing as Alzheimer's. You technically can't officially diagnose Alzheimer's until autopsy. But that's essentially what you're talking about. It's, we can pre-diagnose it. You might not be able to bill for it, in terms of like, hey, I've got the diagnosis code, but you can over time, seeing the patient continually in the same environment with the same people, so you have some semblance of stability. Try to take the variables out of it, aka, hey, we don't really have a randomized control trial.
Right.
But that's really what we try to do as clinicians, is we take what we've been given and just try to run with it. So with these folks with CTE, you're entirely right that you can't just look at somebody and say, hey, that person has had their eggs scrambled a bunch of times. It's the same way you can't look at somebody and say, hey, that person's depressed. I think realistically, from a diagnostic standpoint, one of the things that's going to help us a lot, there are 2 MRI sequences. One is a functional MRI, which is looking real time at the metabolic requirements of the brain. So this is where you have someone in the scanner and you tell them, hey, recite a poem. Hey, read this story. Hey, watch this movie, talk. We want to see how your brain is reacting. Well, at its most basic level, concussions and CTE, all traumatic brain injury, they're disruptions of blood flow, like proper blood flow, and nutrient communication. Well, we can actually see that on MRI, not distinctly because it's not a big bleed, but we can see areas where parts that should be lighting up with certain activities aren't lighting up anymore. Now, that's not perfect because I can't definitively say it is because of CTE, but it gives me a pretty darn good idea, right? If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, chances are it's a duck.
So
I have
go ahead, Ali, please.
Point on that. Out here in California, actually, are you guys familiar with the Amen clinics?
No.
Dr. Amen, very famous guy. Absolutely, I think every single one of you should have this scan done. It's called a SPECT, SPECT, and he's working a lot with CTE. And I think that he can see certain parts of the brain and how how deformed it is. And I don't know, Rick, do you?
Yeah, so SPECT scans, SPECT, and fMRI all look at differing metabolic rates throughout the body. So SPECT is really great because it's a fast scan, especially for folks that, hey, they're prior athletes, so it's hard to fit in an MRI. That's probably a good bet. The SPECT CT is great for looking at everywhere else in the body too, which is an area that is completely overlooked as far as brain injury is concerned. We don't really look at the rest of the body, so I think it's a great thing. If you're the thing that functional MRI has over SPECT is the fact
sorry,
that.
Rick, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off because you kind of cut out there.
I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't your fault. It was the computer's fault. The damn computer. But I wanted to cut in and ask you a question about something you just mentioned, that we don't often scan the whole body when we're talking about the brain. Why would that be necessary? What can we learn from in the body about what's happening in the brain?
Well, I mean, Josh is fantastic for this, but long story short, just think of any time you've been hit really hard. It's not just your head, right? And also, by the way, just thinking common sense, the brain literally controls everything. Cardiologists don't ever want to admit it, but it controls the heart. You know exactly what I'm saying. So remember, the brain also controls vascular tone, how much our blood vessels are opening or closing to let blood in elsewhere. Well, I would not at all be surprised to see that during times of brain injury, you also have derangements in, blood flow to the heart, blood flow to the liver, blood flow to the kidneys. We see that in aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage. It's very common for a patient to have on an EKG what looks like a huge honking heart attack. It's actually just an artifact from the brain. So why don't we look at these patients in a global manner instead of just looking right at the brain?
Yeah.
Josh, you want to jump in?
Yeah, that really speaks to this, how we kind of silo the different medical specialties in Western medicine. And we don't have a tendency to look at the whole patient. We're trying to treat symptoms or one body system. And, to go back to what Rick was saying about kind of trying to like marry the Western medicine with the more traditional or ancient wisdom of these, the shamans and things like that. I mean, that needs to happen sooner rather than later. We're talking about the synthetic cannabinoids and things like that. And one thing that recently occurred to me was I found it analogous to like breast milk and formula. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know how long formula has been around, but it's been around for a long time. And as good as it is as a substitute, there is no substitute for breast milk. It contains everything that's needed. It's the earth energy. It's the everything that Ali was talking about. It's here for it to serve its purpose. And anything that we've tried to do to kind of replicate that kind of falls short. And you see similar things with actual phytocannabinoids compared to the synthetic cannabinoids. It doesn't hit the same way. I wanted to talk about CTE also. I don't know what it is about. Maybe it's so new. Maybe there are huge entities or organizations that have a financial interest in not exploring CTE.
Yeah, that might be it.
That might be part of it, right?
Part of it. Yeah.
But the thing with cannabis medicine is that cannabis has it's such a safe medication. You don't lose anything by having people come in, having adults come in and try it and just kind of monitoring them. And even if we can't do the double-blinded randomized clinical studies, we can still collect that prospective, that information over years and years and years, and that can help us to make sense of all of this.
So are you saying that CTE can be healed by cannabis?
Well, we can't say that. We can't say that because, we're talking, as physicians and scientists, we want to use evidence-based medicine and not anecdotal. But, all of the data tells us that cannabinoids, whether endocannabinoids or phytocannabinoids, they're neuroprotective. They help to slow down, stop, reverse injury. When in response to brain injury, your body releases endocannabinoids. You see an increased amount of circulating endocannabinoids. And so, that should be our sign, that anything related to brain injury, we already know that the body thinks it's a good idea to put some endocannabinoids around it and try to see if we can fix the problem. So, I think it should be full speed ahead on exploring what cannabis can do. Now, if we started protocols and had former athletes and everything, and we could do we could look at a group that that takes CBD or THC or however you want to administer them cannabinoids, and then compare them to a group that doesn't, and we can get a ton of info on that, you know?
Yeah. When CTE first came into the public sphere, it was through Dr. Bennett Amalu and his discovery of, I think it was Mike Webster's brain, who was a Pittsburgh Steelers center and whose behavior was deteriorating, and he was living in his truck. And I don't know if you guys have seen the film Concussion, but it chronicles what he went through. And then for about, 3, 4, 5 years, it was heavy in this public sphere. People were talking about it a lot. There was a concussion settlement and lawsuit and all that stuff. And really, it's pretty much gone away over the last 5 years. And it's been a concerted effort by the NFL Public Relations Department to make that happen and to do the concussion settlement so they can say, look, we're paying out the guys who need it, even though you have to jump through endless hoops to get paid out and do that. And they'll deny, and hope you die. That's what they say they do. Deny, and hope you die. But aside from that, they've changed some of the rules. They've said that, you can no longer target a defenseless player. You can't hit him with your head. They have concussion protocol. When a guy seems to have had a head injury, they pull him out and they send him through a battery of tests, and he has to go through and complete all these tests in order to get back in the game. And I'll open up to all of you. Do you think these measures are effective in curbing CTE, or is it just window dressing, trying to absolve them of any kind of liability and carry on and keep smashing into each other?
Certainly window dressing.
Window dressing?
Yeah. I mean,
completely.
You look at football and it's like, are we going to take football away from us? I mean, I love football, but literally, are we going to take football away? No. So what do? And the guys who want to play, they friggin' want to play. They don't want to give it up. I played rugby for 12 years. I didn't want to give up rugby either. But it's always going to be here. I think that the NFL owners have to take some ownership of that. And until they do, you're right. They're going to ignore it. They're going to push it away, and they're not going to own up to it.
Agreed. Just on a I wouldn't even say cynical note, because it's true, but for just from a 70,000 foot view, we all unfortunately need to make peace with the fact that change costs money, and the people with money don't want to give up their money. Okay, so realistically, how much are we actually going to accomplish with rule changes? Probably not a whole hell of a lot. You'll probably save 1 or 2 guys that would have had devastating injuries otherwise. But realistically, the vast majority of head injuries, and it's borne out by research over and over and over again, occurs in the pre-collegiate level. So and unfortunately, these are also the ages where you have minimal to no supervision as far as monitoring for head injuries go. I can't tell you how many times I was very clearly concussed on tape, and I was sent out the next shift or the next play. Unfortunately, this is one of those things where we're combating human nature too. And, how do you get rid of every drunk driving death in America? Well, you get rid of alcohol. Did that work? Absolutely not. We saw a rise in alcohol consumption and illegal acts related to alcohol. So is there an answer? I truthfully don't know. I don't know if anyone actually knows if there's an answer. It's the same thing to going back to, what do we do about CTE? Well, frankly, we're still trying to learn how to diagnose CTE. This is still in its infancy. So I don't know if there is an answer. There probably is one. Are we close to it? I have no clue.
Okay, so you brought up an interesting point about most of the concussions, most of the head trauma is happening to kids. Mm-hmm. And from what I've gathered over the last 52 minutes of us talking about cannabis and brain trauma, is that cannabis helps people with brain trauma. It helps them when they're going to get hit in the head, and it helps them after they're going to get hit in the head. But cannabis clearly is not legal for kids. But what I'm hearing is it could help. So how do we? CBD is legal for children.
You don't need THC for this.
Okay. So is that in just certain states, or is it, pretty much everywhere?
So
Yes, there are.
from the
Go ahead.
hemp
Go ahead.
plant. Legally, it has to be from the hemp plant. It has to be 0.3% or less THC. If you're if you're a dispensary that has a certain amount of THC, like the products that I sell all have to come from the hemp plant, has to have 0.3% or less THC. If you want more than that, then you have to go to the dispensary, and that's pretty much across the board. But hemp, as of December of 2018, was put in the Farm Bill as now it's a dietary supplement. So it's safe for children. It's like a vitamin. But that said, the hemp industry has absolutely no oversight, just like the vitamin industry, no oversight at all. Talking about, I think Rick had mentioned this, the labs that we have out in California, we were the first state to make marijuana legal in 1996. Well, the labs out here are ridiculous. They were started in the recreational business. They don't have technicians that know how to deal with the technology that I think it was the 2000, whatever the bill was just a couple of years ago, it made all of the dispensaries have lab tested marijuana by a lab that's blah, blah, blah. Well, these labs still don't know how to even run the equipment, and they're running it at 90%, and you got, a pound of pot and you give it to 7 labs and you get 7 different answers. It's the same way out in the hemp world. Now you go to something like extra virgin olive oil. When you go to a food grade lab, their processes, their technicians, their equipment is completely different. And so I think that's where this plant needs to go. We need to have food grade labs that understand a plant, and that you're looking at that type of a plant over and over and over again. So, so yes, hemp, if it's, third party tested, it's safe for kids.
Is CBD with THC more effective for a brain injury?
Well, I'll just say this, and the doctors can back me up on this, that a child's prefrontal cortex is not developed, they think, until their mid-20s. So 25, exactly. So if we have a kid who's getting high 3 times a day, that prefrontal cortex is being affected. And that's a negative thing. For those of us who are over the age of 25 and we get a head injury, or we smoke pot, that prefrontal cortex isn't going to be affected. And they've shown that over and over again. They've shown that all the pot smokers in the 60s have less incidence of Alzheimer's. Why is that? Because pot is an anti-inflammatory.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Josh, do you want to comment on that?
I actually want to hear if Rick knows if, I know that, CBD and THC have a lot of great synergistic effects for a lot of things, but as far as the neuroprotective, I'm not sure. Do you know?
Yeah. No. So it's a double-edged sword, or it can be. So for those who don't know this, THC is a mild vasodilator, means it opens up your blood vessels. So from a I've just been injured standpoint, that is always going to be beneficial, because you want to increase as much brain flow or as much blood flow to the brain as possible, as long as there is no active bleed. That's a big asterisk there. But as long as there is no active bleed, then you want to, like, you think of stroke, we intentionally drive up blood pressures to support arterial blood flow and cerebral blood flow. So there is some, at least theoretical, role for THC in traumatic brain injury. But if we're, again, wanting to be an evidence-based field, well, then we have to look at what evidence is actually available. And the overwhelming majority, data sets that are out there are for many different reasons based on CBD, whether that's the legal regulatory framework, whether that's what their hospital IRB approved. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of the available research is on CBD. So if you're going through the normal regulatory framework of what can and can't be used, it's by far, going to be CBD before THC. Now, going back to neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, the addition of THC is different. The reason that THC helps in those instances is because, like say with Alzheimer's, we're actually breaking down beta amyloid plaques. In Parkinson's, we're actually detangling the neurofibrillary tangles and neutralizing tau proteins. Those are the two things that are implicated in the development of Parkinson's. CBD does not do that by itself. However, what CBD does treat very well, and there's a lot of evidence for it, are what we call the negative symptoms of these. So think more of the depression, the mask-like faces, the problem sleeping, the irritability, all of the things that we would typically give a patient antidepressants for. CBD actually treats those symptoms potentially better.
So cannabis and brain trauma, a lot of promising studies, a lot of promising anecdotal stuff, but we still have a lot to learn. We're almost out of time. I'm going to go around, and if there's anything you didn't mention that you wanted to, a point you wanted to make, now's your chance. We'll start with you, Allie. If you have nothing, and if you've said everything you had to say, then that's cool too.
Yeah, no, of course I always have more to say. So I do have a website, greenallycbd.com. I'm taking cannabis out of the back alley and turning it into a green oasis of healing. But I work with just the hemp plant. And that said, we have developed a CBD product that's been doing excellently with COVID long haulers and with vaccine injuries. And the vaccine injuries are something very weird, where we're getting a lot of neurological issues that nobody can explain. And for some reason, this beautiful plant with all its full spectrum, we've got some proprietary terpenes. I've helped a lot of tremors, eye twitches, people with Lyme, with vaccine injuries and mold. I mean, all these weird things. And then you get no diagnosis, but I've got paralysis. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And the plant, if you can get this plant grown well and extracted well, we see miracles every day with this plant. And I just want to encourage those people out there with brain injuries or any type of mood disorder to really look at cannabis as a whole, and call any one of us and get some coaching on it. And I'm happy to help with any type of coaching and information and nutrition that goes along with this endocannabinoid system. I haven't said that. Catechins, dark chocolate, omega-3s, there are things that can tone our endocannabinoid system, so the CBD that we bring into the body is more effective.
Excellent. Thank you. Joshua.
I don't really have much else to say other than, I think that cannabis is, it's certainly a safe and effective substance for most people. I think that anybody who may be listening, who has any questions or any uncertainty, or who's, needs some reassurance to break that stigma, I'm sure Dr. Wayback, Ali, all of us medical professionals that deal with medical cannabis, what we're here trying to do is to let people know that it's okay. Come ask the questions, you know what I'm saying? Get your questions answered and find out whether it's right for you. I think stress and anxiety and is just at an all-time high. And I think most people out there would probably benefit at least from a little bit of CBD in their lives.
Amen. Rick?
I'm not going to plug anything. I'm just going to quote Timothy Leary. I think everybody needs to tune in, turn on, and drop out.
Nice.
So every human on earth should have access to cannabis and psychedelics, in my humble opinion.
Well,
that's it.
I think this was a great conversation. The hour flew by. I look forward to everyone joining us next time for Athletes for Care and Trulieve, and for Ali Stoddard and Joshua Moore and Rick Wayback. I am Nate Jackson. Thanks for joining us on another panel, Cannabis and Brain Trauma. We'll see you guys next time.